All right, I will say, sorry about that. A good morning, everyone. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Yoel and Sarah Kelman in celebration of completion of Seder Nezikin, and for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael, and Nathan Perry Smith in the schus of the entire Kiyuv. And of course, again, we wait with bated breath in Meretz Hashem today for the return of our hostages, and hopefully the beginning of the return of our hostages, the holding of the ceasefire, Meretz Hashem, perhaps the end to this overwhelming and difficult war, and perhaps again, maybe Tafshin Peivav, maybe 5786 will indeed bring the bracha that we have been davening for thousands of years. Perhaps this is not just an episodic shalom, but maybe there's an opportunity here. Who knows how Kadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, how he choreographs everything, but it certainly feels as if something overwhelming is underfoot, something overwhelming is on the way, and halavai we should just be Zochei Meretz Hashem to be able to see it, to experience it together for all of Klal Yisrael, for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael. Shalom, B'racha, Hatzlachan, Besoros Tovos, now and in Meretz Hashem for many, many years to come. We'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Chav Ches 28. We are beginning at the Mishnah on Chav Zayin Amud Beis 27b. So the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah says, Ashochet es hazevach lizrok damo b'chutz, o miktzos damo b'chutz. So we'll say a person shechs the carbon. And when he shechs the carbon, he does so with the intention. Remember again, here we're speaking about intent. He does so with the intention to go ahead and sprinkle the blood outside of the prescribed area. B'chutz means outside. Now b'chutz can mean outside of the Beis HaMikdash, or b'chutz just simply means outside of wherever you were supposed to do it. O miktzos damo b'chutz, or for example, to sprinkle some of the blood outside of the prescribed area. Same idea. Let's say he had a mind to sacrifice some of the sacrificial parts out of their area, or part of the sacrificial parts out of the area. Or to eat a kizayis of the carbon outside of the prescribed area, or some of a kizayis outside of the prescribed area. Or to eat a kizayis of the ora alya. And I will say, remember again, the alya is the fat of the tail of the animal. I guess easier stated, tail fat, right? It is tail fat of the animal. Now, normally, again, aliyah is burnt on the mizbeach. It's not consumed. It's totally burnt on the mizbeach. So in this case over here, he has in mind to eat from the hide of the tail. From the hide of the tail. So again, just to be clear, what's happened in all of these cases? In all of these cases, ultimately, again, you had an erroneous mindset to either consume, to burn, or to sprinkle outside of the sanctioned area. What we call chutz l'mkomo. That's all of these cases, right? Just all different examples, same case. What's the halacha if you have this type of flawed mindset when it comes to a carbon? Pasul. The carbon itself is invalid. Pasul. Ve'ein bo kares. It is possible, but ultimately, again, what is not punishable by kares. That's category one. So we'll say, so again, just because we have two categories in the Mishnah. Category one is you have in mind to either eat, burn, or sprinkle outside of the permitted area. So the halach is that erroneous mindset fundamentally pasels. It invalidates the carbon. And when we say pasal, what does pasal mean? Pasal generally means both the carbon does not affect atonement, and of course also the meat is going to be prohibited as well. That's case one. Case two, lizrok damo lamachar, miktzas damo lamachar. Now we'll say now in the second category of the Mishnah, what are we dealing with? What we call chutz lizmano. Here you have in mind to, let's say, sprinkle the blood. Let's say you're supposed to sprinkle it on Sunday. Right? You have in mind to sprinkle it on Monday, outside of the permitted time, or sprinkle part of the blood on Monday, or to burn the sacrificial parts tomorrow, or some part of the sacrificial parts tomorrow, to eat the kizayis of the sacrificial meat tomorrow, or some of the kizayis of the sacrificial meat tomorrow, or to eat the kizayis of the tail fat tomorrow. So we'll say, what do we call? So remember, what is this called? Now, this is this is where a person has an erroneous mindset to either eat, sprinkle, or burn part of the carbon outside of the permitted time frame. We call that pigul. That's called pigul. So the Mishnah says, pigul the chayav and alav kares. So we'll say, when I was looking at this Mishnah last night, it's funny, when I was young, when I was a lad, you used to, I'm sorry? Yeah, when I was a lad, I'm not a lad. When I was a lad, so it used to be like Chalamayit Sukkos, like I'd love like going like Simchas Pesach, straight after Simchas Pesach, Shaliva. And now in my twilight years, the truth is, like the ability to sit down in a quiet sukkah with a Gemara, and I would say a glass of wine, but it's really a bottle of wine. And it's like me'ein olam haba. Like a quiet sukkah with a Gemara is just like really, really like, it feels like a little bit like Mashiach. So I say, so why am I sharing this with you? Because last night when I saw this Mishnah, I'm like, oh my gosh, Mishnah, where were you like the last 28 days? Right? This is exactly what it is. This clarity of expression is so incredibly helpful, because we've been ping-ponging a little bit back and forth between an erroneous machshava of chutz limkomo and chutz lizmano. And the word pigul is like bandied around a little bit, and here it's explicit. So again, there are two types of invalidating mindsets. Now the truth is there are more than two, but for our purposes this morning, there are two types of invalidating mindsets. And number one is where you go ahead and you have in mind to go ahead and either sprinkle, burn, or eat a carbon outside of its permitted area. That's what we call chutz limkomo. If you have that mindset, the carbon is pasul, but no chiyuv kares. Category two, you have in mind to burn, eat, or sprinkle carbon outside of its permitted time frame. That's called pigul. And pigul is punishable by kares. So chutz limkomo, outside of its time, pasul, no kares. Chutz lizmano, pasul, kares, called pigul. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so it says the Gemara, but it's fascinating over here also. The Gemara gets caught up on such a fascinating detail that I think we probably would have just skipped over the Mishnah. Sabrua or aliyah, top of chafches, kal yadami. So the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, what do you see from the Mishnah, by the way? That the hide of the tail has the status of the tail, which, by the way, just as an interesting aside, because if you notice, when the Mishnah talks about the tail fat, it doesn't talk about the fat itself. Rather, what does it talk about? The hide of the tail. So Gemara says, by the way, it sounds, based on the Mishnah, the hide has the same status as the tail. Same status as the tail. So the Gemara says, but one second. The whole tail fat thing is very interesting. Why? Because Lamaisa, whichever case it is, whether you have in mind to eat the tail fat outside of its permitted place or outside of its permitted time, that case doesn't make sense. Why not? We'll say, what do you do with tail fat? It's important to know. What do you do with tail fat? You burn it. Tail fat is always, so the Mishnah says, one second, this is not a typical case of a machshava, chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, because at the end of the day, this is something different. This is mechashev me'achilas mizbeach la'adam. In this case, you're having in mind to eat something that is normally burnt on the mizbeach. In other words, that's not a classic case of chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo. The classic cases of chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo is where what? Something would normally be consumed, and you have in mind to consume it either in the wrong place or in the wrong time. But the hide of the tail is a totally separate thing. The tail is burnt on the mizbeach. So what is that even doing over here? This is a case of a person who has in mind to eat an item that is normally fit for the mizbeach. The Gemara calls this mechashev me'achilas mizbeach la'adam. You have in mind to take something from the consumption of the mizbeach and use it for a person. What's going on over here? Amar Shmuel says, Chamani, Rabbi Elazar. This reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer. The Amar mechashvin me'achilas mizbeach la'achilas adam, or me'achilas adam la'achilas mizbeach. So this reflects the view of Shmuel, and Shmuel holds that halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you have in mind to eat something that is normally consumed on the mizbeach, or put something on the mizbeach, ultimately again, that is normally consumed, that type of erroneous mindset does have the ability to invalidate the carbon. In other words, we both say the Havamina is like this. A machshava zara, right? An alien mindset, either chutz limkomo or chutz lizmano, should only really be applicable in a case where the object is subject to consumption. But if it's not subject to human consumption, then why should an erroneous mindset have any level of impact on it? So therefore, again, if I have in mind to eat the hide of the tail tomorrow. So to eat it today, I have in mind to eat it tomorrow. Why do you even call that pigel? At the end of the day, that belongs in the mizbeach, doesn't belong in my stomach. So like, why does that invalidate at all? To which the Gemara says, you're right, this is the view of Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer that an erroneous mindset, even for something that normally was consumed on the mizbeach, and now you have in mind to consume it yourself, that will invalidate the carbon. Where do we see this? From this nan, hashochet hasazavach leachol davar shein darko leachol lahaktir davar shein darko lahaktir kosher. If a person shechts a carbon, and he has in mind to eat something that is not normally consumed, or to burn something that is not normally burnt, kosher. In other words, if you have an erroneous mindset regarding something that is not within your purview, ultimately, again, the carbon is still kosher. So again, this is the Tanakhama, right? So the Tanakhama holds like, so just let's give a perfect example. If you were to go ahead and when you're shechting the animal, you have in mind to eat the tail fat tomorrow. You're supposed to eat it today, but you have in mind to eat it tomorrow, right? So halacha l'maisa, Tanakhama says, that's kosher. That doesn't invalidate the carbon. Why? Because your mindset doesn't make any sense, right? That has nothing to do with anything because you have in mind to eat something that's not really yours to eat. Such an erroneous mindset ultimately, again, doesn't have an impact on the carbon. Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says it's possible. Rabbi Eliezer says not true, not true. An erroneous mindset, even regarding something that is not shaykh to you, right? That you have no real claim to, will still invalidate the carbon. Fascinating machlokes. So the Gemara says, okay, so b'mayokim to Rabbi Eliezer. So now you're establishing our Mishnah that brings up this whole discussion about the height of the tail. Like Rabbi Eliezer, Ema Seifa, but look at the end of the Mishnah. Zakla, what does the end of the Mishnah say? This is the rule. What's the rule? Kol hashochet v'hamakabel v'hamolich v'hazorek lechol davar shedarko lechol. Right, that if you go ahead and you shecht and you do kabbalah and molich, meaning holachi, take the mizbeach, and zrika, and you do it for something that is fit to eat, subject to consumption, ulahakdir davar shedarko lahakdir, or ultimately, again, you burn something that is fit to be burned. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? Davar shedarko in, shein darko lecholo. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, the later Mishnah, which actually is tomorrow's daf, right? So the later Mishnah talks about this idea that invalidating mindsets really only impact the carbon when you have it regarding something that is fit to be consumed or fit to be burnt, which sounds like what? Asan Rabbanan. That reflects the view of the Rabbanan. So we'll say if that's the case, then Reish Rabbi Eliezer is Sefer Rabbanan. Then the beginning of the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, the end of the Mishnah reflects the view of the Rabbanan. Now remember, again, normally we don't like to do that. We don't like to have one Mishnah which reflects two different opinions. We like to have one harmonious opinion. So we'll say, to which the Gemara says, Amar lei in. He said, yeah, that's why the Mishnah is set up. So I just want to point out, because this is important. So remember, the first nugget of information that the Mishnah is introducing us to is something very interesting. If you have an erroneous mindset, let's say for consumption, regarding a part of the carbon that is not really designated for human consumption, does that erroneous mindset undermine the effectiveness of the carbon? That's the machlokes over here. The Rabbanan say no, and Rabbi Eliezer says yes. Example of this: I shech the carbon. I have in mind to eat the hide of the tail tomorrow. So it's to be eaten today. I have in mind to have it tomorrow. Does that make the carbon into pigel? Rabbi Eliezer will say, well, let's start with Rabbanan. Rabbanan will say no, because since that hide is not subject to human consumption, an erroneous mindset about consumption will not undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. On the other hand, Rabbi Eliezer will say, yes, it does. Yes, it does. That's our fundamental machlokes. Okay, so they will say, based on that, our Mishnah, which talks about a case of pigel by hide of the tail, must be reflecting ultimately, again, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. But yet the end of the Mishnah means for us our next Mishnah. Emir Hashem is going to reflect the view ultimately, again, of the Rabbanon. Incredible. Incredible. Says the Gemara as follows. The Gemara goes weiter. That's our first approach. Rav Huna Amar, or al yalav ka al yadami. Ultimately, again, Rav Huna says, Ravavi, they're going to, 9 o'clock meetings in the main shul. Right, so Rav Huna says, so Ar al Yalav Ka al Yadam is the sign. Okay, thank you. So Rav Huna, I forgot to post it on the community. Okay, so Rav Huna Amar Ar al Yalav Ka al Yadami. So Rav Huna, on the other hand, he disagrees. He says, no, the hide of the tail is not like the tail. In other words, remember, if you notice the case of the Mishnah was very specific, talking about an erroneous mindset to eat the hide of the tail, not the tail fat itself. To which Rav Huna comes along and says, essentially, hide is different than the tail, has a different status. Excuse me. My time into Rav Huna. What's Rav Huna's logic? Because when the Torah speaks about the part of the tail that's burnt on the Mizbeach, what does it refer to? It refers to the fat of the tail and not the hide of the tail. Therefore, again, the hide, technically speaking, is a consumable part of the karban, which is why the Mishnah says that if you have an erroneous mindset regarding it, it could fundamentally undermine the effectiveness of the karban. Rav Chisda says no. The olam or ha'alya ka'alya dami. So Rav Chisda goes back and Rav Chisda says no, like we thought originally, or like the Gemara wanted to suggest before. That in reality, the or of the right, the hide of the tail is just like the fat of the tail itself. What's the case over here? What's the case? Ba'alya shel gidi. Interestingly enough, what are we dealing with over here? We're ultimately dealing with the tail fat of a goat. So apparently, goat, right? When you offer up a goat, so ultimately, again, that tail fat is not burnt on the mizbeach. Okay, interesting. So remember again, we're going to get into, in general, Gemara is always an element of Gemara that's out of order. So most times it's not such a big deal for us because we're familiar enough with the concepts. When it comes to karbanos, sometimes the lack of order for us is a little bit confusing. So we'll see all of these details in Meretz Hashem, like which karbanos are burnt, how they're burnt, different designations of karbanos. But point over here is tail fat of a goat offering ultimately, again, is not burnt on the mizbeach. So perhaps when the Mishnah is speaking about over here, the hide of the tail, what kind of tail is it talking about? Tail of a goat, because by a goat, the tail fat is not burnt at all in the mizbeach. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara says, "Kulu kishmo lo amri." Now the Gemara goes through the respective opinions. So why don't the other opinions agree with Shmuel, right? Shmuel wanted to set it up like Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Because the Gemara says, because they don't like the idea of setting up the Mishnah according to two different and distinct opinions. Why don't they hold like Rav Huna? So the Gemara says, because ultimately, again, they don't like Rav Huna because they hold that halacha l'maisa, the hide of the tail has the status of the fat of the tail as well. So why don't they hold like Rav Chisda? To which the Gemara says, "My kamash malan." Or alya ka'alya, because what is Rav Chisda coming to teach us? That ultimately, again, the hide of the tail is like the fat of the tail. We learned that. The Gemara says, Tanina, we learned that already. Where did we learn that? Ve'elu sha'orosen kibsaran, the following carbonic situations, ultimately, again, their hide is just the same, has the same status as their flesh. What are those cases? Or shetachas ha'alya, ultimately, again, the hide underneath the fat. So the Gemara says, so we already saw that explicitly. So if that's what it's coming to teach me, I know that already. Rav Chisda, it's derech. Rav Chisda said still the Mishnah needed to highlight this. Why? I would have thought that when do we say the hide of the tail is like the tail, that's in matters of tumah. Tumah. Why? Because since the hide is soft like the fat, therefore, again, I would have thought it's mistarfid, it combines for tumah purposes. About hacha, but over here by carbonic purposes, ema lemashcha. So this is incredible. The pasuk says lemashcha. In other words, the pasuk is Badara Hashem el Aaron v'ani hini nesati lecha es mishmeres shumasi lechol kodshei bnei Yisrael lechol nasativ lemashcha ulevanecha adalam. What does this mean? Ligdula. Karbanos are both say in general. You have to understand something. The Mizbeach is considered to be like the Shulchan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the table of Hashem. And therefore the Karbanos are offered up on the table of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, again, Karbanos in general have to be given in a way that represents greatness. Ligidula kider, so Gemara says, therefore, I would have thought like this. Ligidula kider shema lachem ochlin. Essentially, there's carbonic consumption reflects monarchical consumption, right? Velo avide malachi da'achli hachi. And a king wouldn't normally eat the hide of the tail. It's not a part of the animal that a king would eat. So because it's not a part of the animal that the king would eat, I would have thought, therefore, for carbonic purposes, the hide is not considered to be like a carbonic portion. So when I say emalo, Kamashmal, the Gemara says, it is. Kamashmal, the hide of the tail, is not just part of the flesh, ultimately, again, for tumah purposes, but is also there for carbonic purposes as well. I raised the Gemara, Meisve, Gemara is the Kasha. Meisve, Hashochet, Es ha'olah, lahaktir kizayis me'ar, shetachas ha'alya, chutz limkomo, Pasal ve'in bo kares. So we'll see, now listen to this. Gemara quotes from our Mishnah. If a person has in mind, right, a person shechts an olah, right, shechting an olah. Remember, olah is the carbon that is totally consumed on the mizbeach, totally consumed on the altar. And he does it with the intention to go ahead and burn a kizayis of the hide of the tail outside of its prescribed time. So he has a machshava for chutz limkomo, but it's a very specific mindset, right? What's his very specific ideation? Is again to burn a kizayis of the hide, tail hide, outside of the prescribed times. What's the halacha? Pasal ve'in bo kares. Ultimately, again, it's pasal and validates the carbon, but there's no kares because it's chutz limkomo. What about chutz lizmano? What if he has in mind to burn a kizayis of the tail hide outside of the appropriate time? Then what's the halacha? Pigel. Then it's pigel. The chayav and alav and karis. Chayav alav karis. You chayav karis or pigel. Okay. Elazar ben Yehuda ish avalya omer mishum Rabbi Yaakov. V'chein hayar Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda ish kfar ikos omer mishum Rabbi Shimon. Achad ar beis haprasos. So whether we're talking about, again, the hide, the hoof hide of a small animal, or the echad rosh or harosh shel egel harach, or the head hide of a young calf, the echad or shetachas ha'alya, or whether you're talking about, again, the hide underneath the tail, the chol shamanu chachamim gabi tuma, the elu sha'orosein kibsaran, and in any case, ultimately, again, where Chazal said by Tumah that the hide has the status of the flesh, lahavi or shal beis haboshes, to include like the flesh by the genital area. In all of these cases, chutz limkomo pasal, a machshava to consume it or to burn it outside of the permitted area will make the carbon pasal. Vein bo kares, chutz limzmano pigol v'chayav and alav kares. So we're saying all that again. So all the Mishnah just said. So we'll say, just look what the Gemara just did. So we're saying all of these cases, wherever Chazal said that, let's say by Tumah, that the hide has the same status of the flesh, what is true by Tumah will be true by carbon. And therefore, again, if you have in mind to eat part of this hide outside of the permitted area, ultimately it renders the carbon pasal, but no kares. Outside of the permitted time, pasal and kares, because that's called pigel. Now, what is the Gemara picking up on? The way that the Gemara framed this is, what's the discussion talking about over here? An olah, which makes it sound like this halacha is only applicable to an olah, but not by regular carbon. Olah in zevachlos. Maybe this is a specific din by olah. So b'shtamal Rav Huna hainu diktani olah. So this makes sense by Rav Huna. This is why it says olah. Ela Rav Chisda. My area detani olah, but according to Rav Chisda, why does the dafka mention olah? Listni zevach, just say zevach, because it applies to all karbanos in general. Rav Chisda says, you're right, it's possible, like we said before, that we're talking about, again, the tail fat of a goat. So remember, again, goat tail fat, goat tail fat is not burned on the mizbeach. So the other possibility ultimately is, go ahead and reframe this ultimately again as zevach, as carbon. So we'll say, so bottom line, so in other words, don't say, it shouldn't say olah, rather it should say zevach, meaning it applies to all carbonos. So we'll say, so just point out something interesting. So there's just an interesting fact that comes out of this, that, because this gets into an interesting discussion about which parts of the animal are subject essentially to a carbonic sanctity, or specifically have the status of carbonic flesh. So now the Gemara gave me a principle which is important. Anything that is considered to be flesh, ultimately, again, for tumah purposes, by definition, is considered to be flesh for carbonic purposes as well. Incredible. We still are left with our overarching machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, ultimately, again, where if you have an erroneous mindset by something that is not consumable, not fit for human consumption, or not, when I say not fit, not permitted for human consumption, does that undermine the effectiveness of the carbon or not? The Chachamim say yes. Rabbi Eliezer says no, and that machlokes still remains outstanding. Good. Let's go weiter. Pasal bein bo kares. So we'll say this is a very exciting Gemara. Why? Because remember, again, the Mishnah outlined for me two categories. What are my two categories? And this is, we'll say, probably one of the most important things we're going to be learning over the next little bit. Right? What are our two categories? Chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano. chutz limkomo, I have in mind to eat the karban. Or by the way, when I say eat doesn't just have to mean eat. What does eat mean? Eat means any part of the sacrificial service. So it can mean eat, it can mean burn, it can mean sprinkle. I have in mind to do something carbonically significant outside of the permitted space, right, where it's supposed to be done. That's called chutz limkomo. That mindset makes the karban puzzle, but no kares. Same thing I have in mind to eat, burn, sprinkle outside of the permitted time frame, time window. What is that called? Pigel. That's called pigel, ultimately again, and you get kares. So now the Gemara says, Minhani mili. How do you know? In other words, we'll say, because this is actually quite fascinating, that an erroneous mindset, chutz lizmano, is puzzle, but no, sorry, chutz lizmano is puzzle and kares, and yet chutz limkomo is puzzle, no kares. I'm going to say, how do you know that? Where exactly do I know that from? Amar Shmuel, so Shmuel says, Trei Kraik Sidi. Shmuel says, there are two psukim. So Mahi, what two psukim are we talking about? So this is very exciting. Mahi, Amar Rabba. So Shlishi, Zeu Chutz Lizmano. So we'll say, so okay, let's talk about the pasuk over here, because we're going to see these two psukim. Both of these psukim in Chumash Vayikra. One of them in Chumash Vayikra itself, in the beginning of Vayikra, and one of them in Parshas Kedoshim. So the first pasuk quoting over here is like this. Let me read to the pasuk. It's Ve'em he'achol ye'achal mibasar zevach shlamav b'yom hashlishi. If you eat from the flesh of the karban on the third day. Now the karban talking about over here has a 2-day consumption window, which is often normal for karbanos. In other words, let's say I shech the karban today, Sunday, so then I would have 2 days and 1 night. Essentially, Sunday, Monday to eat the karban. By Monday night, anything left over is going to become nosar. So the Mishnah, so the pasuk says, and if you v'ma'achol yachal, I'm just reading the pasuk, v'ma'achol yachal mibsar zevach shamav b'yom hashlishi, on the third day, lo yiratzeh. Hamakriv also lo yichashev lo pigel yihia. Okay, so the Torah says third day it'll be pigel. Va'nefesh halcheles mimena avonatisa, and whoever eats from it once it's pigel, ultimately again will bear its iniquity, will bear its punishment. Okay, so now watch this. So the Gemara says shlishi. When it says eat it on the third day, zeu chutz lizmano, that refers to consumption of a karban outside of its permitted time. That's chutz lizmano. Pigel, when it says pigel, zeu chutz limkomo, that refers ultimately again to outside of its permitted area. So we'll say, which is a pretty wild drasha, right? Because what's pigel? Chutz lizmano, right? So just follow this through. In other words, we're going to work this through a little bit, right? So the Gemara says, I apologize. I know that our timing is off a little bit this morning. So, okay, we'll go. And of course, I understand if anybody has plans, Baruch Hashem. So we don't lock the doors. We never lock the doors, right? Yeah, except during the drasha. Then it's like so pigel. So listen. So shlishi, when it says shlishi, ultimately again zeu chutz lizmano. So shlishi refers to eating. And when I say eating again, eating, burning, sprinkling outside of the permitted time. Pigel zeu chutz limkomo. That refers to outside of its permitted space. Va'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu. And ultimately, again, then the pasuk says, and a person who consumes of this, avonatisa, will bear its iniquity, which means kares. So the Gemara says, echad v'lo shnayim. Clearly, the kares penalty is only going on one of the aforementioned infractions and not both, right? Because the pasuk mentions both chutz lizmano, or chutz limkomo, that's pigel, or I should say chutz lizmano, that's shlishi, and then pigel, that's chutz limkomo. And then it says in the singular, and a person who does this, ultimately again, will be chayiv kares, which means the chayiv kares only goes back on one of them and not both of them. So the Gemara says, so which one does it go back on? Zeu chutz lizmano u'lemeute chutz limkomo. So which one does kares go back on? Kares goes back ultimately again on chutz lizmano and not chutz limkomo. So what do you see from here? You see from here that the kares penalty ultimately devolves on chutz limkomo, not chutz lizmano. So we'll say, so by the way, I don't want to say worst drasha ever, right? But not compelling at all, right? And again, the Gemara is going to talk about this, like that's like a totally arbitrary interpretation of the pasuk, which we're going to challenge it. So the Gemara goes right there. Ve'ema ba'nefesh ha'cheles mimenu zeu chutz limkomo. So maybe when it says, I don't understand, how do you know that? Maybe when it says kares at the end of the pasuk, maybe that's referring to chutz limkomo, ulemeute chutz lizmano, and it comes to exclude chutz lizmano from kares. In other words, how do you know that kares is going back on chutz lizmano and not chutz limkomo? Mistabra chutz limkomo adif to pasuk bay. Well, remember, because at the end of chutz lizmano, it makes sense to say that chutz lizmano is primary. Why? Because ultimately, again, it's what the pasuk started with. Okay, to which we're going to remember again, because most remember the Gemara now is learning out chutz lizmano from what? From shlishi, which is the first word of the pasuk, first part of the pasuk. So the fact that chutz lizmano is being learned out first would seem to assign it primacy. And therefore, again, when there is kares, the kares penalty ultimately goes on that. Adrabah, chutz limkomo adif to samechle. I can say just the opposite. Chutz limkomo should get kares. Why? Because chutz limkomo is the infraction that's juxtaposed to kares. It's right there in the pasuk. So therefore, both say the drasha doesn't really work. Drasha doesn't really work. Ela Amar Abaye ki asa Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi Amarav Samech Adetani Tana Kishu Omer Shlishi Parshas Kedoshim. Oh, Rabbi say there's another pasuk, a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. Now, Rabbi say this pasuk says Bim ha'achol ye'achel bayom ha'shlishi pigulhu lo yiratzeh. Right. So the pasuk says, and if you will eat it on the third day, it is pigul; it will not be accepted. Second pasuk. So the Gemara says, "Shomer shlishi beparshas kedoshim to you." Which I will say, this to me was also fascinating. I don't know. I'm not holding, but like, I don't ever remember the Gemara quoting the name of a parsha. Right? It's interesting. Generally, again, there's no attribution in Pesukim, right? It's just interesting. It's just interesting. See here, when the Torah is Kishu Omer Shlishi beParshas Kedoshim Tiyu, just fascinating, right? The Gemara just generally quotes Pesukim. Where does it ever go ahead and ultimately say Shlishi Parshas Kedoshim? So only I could think about. I was thinking about this last night. Like obviously, there's no coincidences, and especially in Daf Yomi, Baruch Hu gives us all these different beautiful messages. If you think about it, so tonight we're about to enter in to the third leg of Kiddusha of Sukkos, right? Because the first part of the Kiddusha of Sukkos was first day's Yantiv. Second part of the Kiddusha of Sukkos is Shabbos Chol Hamoed. And the third leg, there are 4 legs to Sukkos, right? But the third leg to the Kiddusha of Sukkos ultimately is Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah. And each of these parts of Sukkot has their own unique and beautiful avod associated. But Hoshana Rabbah, right, means so many different things. But on the most basic level, Hoshana Rabbah is the day in which the petak, in which the kvitlach, with our gzar din, with our decree for the year, are delivered to the Beis Din Shel Nala, right, for final review. That's the power of Hoshana Rabbah. That's why we get together tonight to learn and Fabrang, because at the end of the day, our judgment has not yet been sealed, and there's still an opportunity to turn things around, and there's still an opportunity to hopefully transform things just into an unequivocally positive din. So it's just incredible. Look at these words: Shlishi beParshas Kedoshim Tiyu. Sometimes what we've been unable to accomplish over the Yamim Tovim so far. Right? Sometimes even what we're unable to accomplish, on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, first part of Sukkot, second part of Sukkot. Sometimes it's the Shlishi where you become Kedoshim Tiyu. Sometimes it's the Shlishi. Sometimes in Hoshana Rabbah, that's when you pull out all the stops. That's when you're really able to actualize your personalistic Kedusha. And halavai we should be Zochem. Meretz Hashem Kishu Omer Shlishi beParshas Kedoshim Tiyu Shein Tamud Lomar Shahari Kvar Ne'emar. Now that pasuk is totally unnecessary, right? What is the pasuk? In other words, that pasuk in Kedoshim is pretty much an exact repeat of what we saw before. So what's going on over here? The pasuk already said this. The pasuk already said that if you eat of the kavan on the third day, it becomes pigul. So why does the pasuk need to repeat it in Parashas Kedoshim? Amud Beis im eno inyan lechutz lizmano Tineu the inyan chutz limkomo. So so ultimately, again, if I don't need it for chutz lizmano, right, because I can learn that from the previous pasuk, then ultimately, again, use it to teach me chutz limkomo. Incredible. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. So the Gemara says, actually, no, fine, look at Rashi. He says, upigol dikra aricha, ditzavis aron, lo tijur shel chutz limkomo, elakule kra b'chutz lizmano. So we'll say, now watch this. So once I have this extraneous pasuk, this additional pasuk, that second pasuk ultimately in Parshas Kedoshim could be fully dedicated to chutz limkomo, which then frees up the first pasuk in Parshas Tzav, ultimately for what? Chutz lizmano, which means that entire pasuk is talking about what? Pigol. And that pasuk explicitly says that what? Kares. Right? What was the lashon of the pasuk? V'nefesh ha'ocheles avonat tisa. Kares. So now this is beautiful. Now the first pasuk in Parashas Tzav is fully dedicated ultimately again to chutz lizmano, which is pigol, and tells you that pigol is kares. And the second pasuk in Parashas Kedoshim, ultimately, which doesn't talk about kares, it just says lo yeratzeh. It used lashon of pigol, but it says lo yeratzeh. That's talking about chutz limkomo, and chutz limkomo is puzzle. That's what it means when it says pigol. It's puzzle. But no chiv kares. Beautiful. The universe is in absolute harmony in this moment, right? So now I've got a pasuk in Parashas Tzav for chutz lizmano, which is pigol, a pasuk ultimately in Parashas Kedoshim for chutz limkomo, which is puzzle. The Torah calls puzzle pigol, but there's no chiv kares. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, "Umiyit rachmana gavinosar." But yet the Torah ultimately again has an exclusionary phrase by nosar. Va'ochlav avono yisa. Pasuk says by nosar also there's a chiv kares lemeute chutz limkomo. Ultimately again to exclude chutz limkomo. Ultimately again from kares. Because we're both saying the problem I have now, as much as that's beautiful, that there's a pasuk in Parashas Tzav that ultimately again is pasuk in Parashas Tzav that is chutz lizmano, pigol, and therefore kares, and pasuk in Parashas Kedoshim, which is chutz limkomo. The Torah still uses lashon of pigol by chutz limkomo. So how do I know that that doesn't mean kares by chutz limkomo as well? Right? In other words, it's still using the same biblical language of pigol in both places. So the fact I got it, it doesn't say kares in Parashas Kedoshim, but still, how do I know that chutz limkomo is not subject to kares? To which the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the Gemara we're going to see now, the Gemara says, "Umiyit rachmana gavinosar." And the Torah has a miyut ultimately again by nosar, where it says, that those who eat nosar ultimately are bear iniquity, and it says by nosar there's a chiv kares, but ultimately the miute chutz limkomo. But to exclude chutz limkomo ultimately again from any kares bearing reality. Ve'ema va'ochlav avona yisa zel chutz limkomo. But why don't I say that maybe the phrase "ochlav avanoyisa" refers ultimately again to chutz limkomo, and chutz limkomo is chayiv kares, and ultimately again nosar is not. Mistabra nosar havadelu ukmei bekares. Right? It makes more sense to say that nosar is subject to kares. Why? Lemigmar avon lechutz lizmano dedamile bizab. Because ultimately, again, there's a gzera shava of avon to chutz lizmano, right? So right, this gzera shava of it says avon ultimately again by chutz lizmano, right, which is pigol, and ultimately says avon by nosar, and nosar and chutz lizmano are similar to each other in that they share two similarities, right? Zab. What are the two similarities? Zman. Ultimately, again, both chutz lizmano and nosar are both fundamentally subject to time, right? They're both hinging on time. And interestingly enough, they both apply by bamas. So when bamas, personal altars, ultimately, again, were permitted, these two disqualifications of nosar and chutz lizmano ultimately still applied. Interesting. Adrabah, actually just the opposite. Chutz limkomo havilelo ukmi bekares. I can make the argument that chutz limkomo should be subject to kares. Why? Because I could say lemigmar avon l'chutz lizmano. Because I can make ultimately again a gzera shava of avon between chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, and also how so? The Gemara says the damile b'mikdash. Ultimately, again, because I will say it has many similarities as well. What are the similarities? Number one, machshava, ktsas, dam, and shlishi. If you take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says b'mikdash. It's the first wide line in Rashi. Mem machshava, that refers to thought. Kuf ktsas, dalid dam, shin shlishi. Now, what it's mean? It's actually really beautiful Gemara. So listen to this. Shlishi chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo shnei psul machshava. Right? So I'm sorry. Chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo shneim psul machshava. V'mchishe b'miktaso nifsa. So say first of all, so both chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, both of them are thought. Machshava. That's the mem. Next. V'mchishu b'miktaso nifsal kulo. Furthermore, kuf ktsas, even if you have an erroneous mindset of chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano with just a little bit of ktsas, ultimately invalidates the carbon. Next, ushneim nifsam ba'avodas hadam, that's the dalid. Both of them could be disqualified during the blood service. Ubishneim nemar shlishi, and the pasuk uses lashon of shlishi by both of them. La'afuki tuma de'ena pasal machshava. Now this excludes the case of tuma, because by tuma, ultimately, again, an erroneous mindset does not do anything. Furthermore, part of it becomes tamei, not all of it becomes tamei. But ultimately, it's also subject to tuma after zrika, and there's no shlishi. And there's no shlishi that's mentioned. Rabbi Yochanan says, also back to the Gemara, Tani Zvidi Bar Levi, Asya Kodesh Kodesh. We make a gzir sheva of Kodesh Kodesh. Ksif hacha es Kodesh Hashem Chilel v'nichrasa. It says over here, right? As Kodesh Hashem Chilel. Ultimately, again, this is the pasuk by Nosar, right? As Kodesh Hashem Chilel v'nichrasa, that if you eat Nosar, you're subject to kares. Ksiv hasam v'sarafta es hanosar ba'esh. Ma lahalon Nosar, just like over there, it's about Nosar. Afkan Nosar. So to here it's Nosar. Umiyet Rachmani Gabe Nosar, Ba'ochlav Avono Yisa, Lemeute Chutzlim Komo Mikares. And therefore, Moshe says, Dafka by Nosar, and then have Magzir Shava from Nosar to Chutzlizmano, which ultimately comes to exclude Chutzlim Komo from Kares. Beautiful. Umay Chazis, Tekra Aricha B'Chutzlizmano. So what I say now? Fine. Now remember, all of this is predicated about the following idea, that what we call the longer pasuk, right? The longer pasuk in Parshas Tzav is going to be talking about Chutzlizmano, and the shorter pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about Chutzlim Komo. To which the Gemara says, just by the way, Umay Chazis Tekra Aricha B'Chutzlizmano, Ushlishi de Parshas Kedoshim Tiyu Chutzlim Komo. How do you know that? How do you know that the longer pasuk in Parshas Tzav is talking about Chutzlizmano, and the shorter pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is talking about Chutzlim Komo? How do you know that? Epoch. I can say just the opposite. Epochano. I can say just the opposite. It's the opposite. To which the Gemara says no. Mistabra aricha b'chutzlizmano. It makes more sense that the longer pasuk, which is the first pasuk in Parshas Tzav, is talking about Chutzlizmano. Why? The Gamar Avon Minosar, the Damile Bizav. Because we both say, remember again, that first pasuk has the lashon of Vanefesh Ocheles Mimena Avona Tisa Avon. And there's Gzeir Shav of Avon from Chutzlizmano to Nosar, and also just like Nosar is Kares, therefore Chutzlizmano is going to be Kares. Adarabba, say just the opposite. Aricha b'chutzlim komo shlishi, the kedoshim tiyu b'chutzlizmano, mishum dedamilei. Oh, I can make just the opposite, right? I can make just the opposite idea. That ultimately, again, that maybe the second pasuk, ultimately, again, let the first pasuk, what Gemara calls it the longer pasuk in Parashas Tzav, let the longer pasuk be talking about chutzlim komo, and the shorter pasuk in Kedoshim ultimately talking about chutzlizmano, mishum dedamilei. The Gemara says, samche dekamemaitle. Ultimately, and I will say this juxtaposition to ultimately again chutz mizmano to kares, and therefore again it's excluded. Ela amarava, and therefore excluded from kares. Ela amarava kulu mikra aricha asyon tichsiv You know what that Shavuot say? You know what? We'll stop over here with Ella Amar Rava. We'll stop over here. Stop over here. Shavuot say, just understanding. Mar just ended up with a question. So let's just highlight over here. So what the way the Gemara set up everything was as follows: that halacha l'maisa. Here's what we know, right? Let's go with our facts. Mishnah taught me that a machshava for chutz limkomo, to either eat, burn, sprinkle a part of the carbon outside of the permitted area. What does that do to the carbon? What does it do? Puzzle, but no kares. Chutz lizmano, if you have in mind to either burn, sprinkle, eat outside of the permitted time, bigel, and so which means puzzle and kares. So now the Gemara said, how do you know that? Because to be honest, those things sound really similar. So the fact that one is kares and one is not kares, where are you getting that from? What does it essentially come down to? Two psukim in Chumash Vayikra. One in Parshas Tzav, which the Gemara calls the long pasuk, and one in Parshas Kedoshim, which the Gemara calls the short pasuk. The way the Gemara wanted to line it up is this whole exercise was that the Gemara ultimately said the longer pasuk is talking about chutz lizmano, right? And therefore, again, there's Gzera Shava. It says the pasuk says Avon Gzera Shava from that pasuk to Nosar. Just like Nosar is Chayv and Kares, so to Chutz Lizmano is Chayv and Kares as well. The second pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, ultimately, again, the shorter pasuk the Gemara calls it, is talking about Chutz Lim Komo, and there's no explicit mention of Kares in that particular Chutz Lim Komo. No explicit mention of Kares in that pasuk. The Gemara just challenged that. Right? The Gemara just says, I don't understand. I could just as easily flip that entire thing around, right? I could go ahead and flip that entire thing around, and ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa learn it out differently. So we're kind of ending off on that question. Rava is going to come along and kind of set this whole thing straight, but in Meretz Hashem, that's where we're leaving off. So again, we thought we had a construct. It was a pretty good construct. We then challenged the construct, and Rava is going to realign things to us. So we'll say, we're going to continue Meretz Hashem tonight. So again, daf tonight is at 7:45. Weather permitting, it'll be in the Sukkah. We have a beautiful, beautiful Leil Hoshana Rabbah planned. It's going to be just a very beautiful and uplifting evening. So again, we're doing tomorrow's daf tonight. So that'll be 7:45 this evening, probably 7:45 to approximately 8:30, give or take an hour. So approximately 8:30. And then in Meretz Hashem, 8:30, we're going to be doing Chassidus Chabura. Not our regular Chassidus Chabura. We're going to be focusing on Inyani Hoshana Rabbah, Meretz Hashem, together in the Sukkah. We'll farbrang a little bit as well. Be a beautiful evening. Shkayach everyone, a good night, and a beautiful, beautiful day. Besaros Tovos for Klal Yisrael. All right, Chevron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. A good night, everyone. Really?